This is my true story. I gave everything I had to my son, my time, my energy, my love, my savings. I worked through sickness, skipped meals, and sacrificed sleep so he could have a better life. I thought when he grew up that love would come back to me in kindness, but one day he told me to stop calling. His voice was calm, but it cut deep. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just stayed quiet. What happened after changed everything. Before I tell you, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and please subscribe so more people can hear my story. The call came on a quiet afternoon. I had just finished cooking lunch and thought I'd check on him. It had been a week since I'd heard his voice. I called, expecting to hear something small, maybe an update, maybe a quick hello. He answered after the third ring. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was cold, the kind of cold that makes you realize warmth isn't coming back. "Stop calling, Mom. We're busy." That was all he said. No anger, no argument, just final. In the background, I could hear laughter, hers, his wife's voice, light and careless, the sound of a life that no longer needed me. He didn't even wait for me to reply before hanging up. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. I stared at the phone for a long time, my hand still holding it to my ear, waiting for a voice that wasn't coming back. For years, my days had revolved around those small moments, calls to check if he'd eaten, messages to ask if he needed anything, reminders that someone was still thinking of him. I never realized how much of my day depended on those seconds until they were gone. I tried to tell myself it wasn't cruel, that maybe he was tired or distracted. But deep down, I knew what that sentence meant. It wasn't about being busy. It was about moving on. It was about a son who had built a life so full that there was no space left for the person who gave it to him. That night, I sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The food on the table went cold. I thought about the hundreds of times I'd picked up his calls when he needed help. The time he couldn't make rent and I covered it. The time his car broke down and I paid the repairman over the phone. The nights he cried over heartbreak and I stayed up talking until dawn. All those moments had vanished into one sentence. "Stop calling, Mom." "We're busy." I replayed it in my head until it lost sound and became only a feeling. The feeling of being dismissed, of realizing your place in someone's life has quietly expired. For the first time in years, I didn't call back. I didn't send a message. I didn't even scroll through his photos online like I usually did. I just sat still, trying to understand how a person can become unnecessary to their own child. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't have tears left. It was something deeper than sadness. It was acceptance. Not the kind you choose, but the kind that forces itself on you when you have no other option. I realized that day that parenthood doesn't end when they grow up. It ends when they stop listening. The next morning, I looked at the phone again. It was still, black screen, no calls, no notifications. I thought of calling him again, just once, to say I was sorry if I'd disturbed him. But I stopped myself. I hadn't done anything wrong. Love shouldn't need permission. Caring shouldn't require scheduling. So I placed the phone in the drawer, next to the unpaid bills and unread letters, and closed it. That single action felt heavier than anything I'd ever done. In the days that followed, I waited out of habit, not hope. Every evening around the same time, I'd look toward the phone, expecting it to light up. It never did. I learned quickly that silence has its own weight, not sharp, not sudden, but slow and steady, pressing against your chest until you get used to it. I told myself he was busy. That's what he said. That's what I chose to believe, even if believing hurt more than the truth. When night came again, I sat in bed, listening to the ticking of the clock. The sound seemed louder than usual, each tick reminding me of minutes I couldn't get back. I finally turned off the light and whispered to myself, "He's busy." It was easier to repeat his excuse than to face the reality that maybe he just didn't want to talk. That's how love ends sometimes, not with shouting, not with betrayal, but with quiet disinterest. And that night, I stopped dialing. I stopped waiting for him to remember. I learned that silence, once it begins, doesn't ask for permission to stay. The days after that call moved slower than I'd ever known time could move. Each morning I woke up and looked at the phone before even getting out of bed. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a missed call, maybe a small message that said, "Sorry." There was nothing. The The screen stayed dark. I tried to fill my mornings with chores to keep from thinking. I cleaned the kitchen twice a day. I washed clothes that weren't dirty. I rearranged drawers that didn't need fixing, but no matter what I did, the house felt louder. The ticking of the clock sounded heavier. The hum of the refrigerator seemed sharper. Even the floor creaked like it wanted to remind me I was alone. For years, that house had been full of noise. His voice, his footsteps, his laughter. They had filled every corner. Even after he married and moved out, I used to imagine him still here when I cooked his favorite meals. I'd set 2 plates on the table out of habit, even though one stayed untouched. I couldn't break the routine. It made me feel like he was still connected to this home somehow. But after that call, even the habit felt wrong. I still cooked for 2, but I threw 1 plate of food away every night. It felt like throwing away memories, 1 meal at a time. The neighbors started asking why my son didn't visit anymore. I smiled and said he was busy, the same word he used on me. Busy. Such a small word to cover such a big emptiness. I said it so many times that it started to sound normal. But inside it burned. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings watching families walk by, children holding their parents' hands, couples laughing, people taking pictures together. I never envied them. I just wondered when love became something people outgrew. One evening I tried to call again. My finger hovered over his name on the screen for a long time. I couldn't do it. The memory of his voice saying, "Stop calling," was still sharp in my head. I put the phone down and decided that maybe he was right. Maybe he needed space. Maybe I had become one of those parents who called too much, who cared too loudly. So I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't even check his social media for a while. I convinced myself that silence was respect. Days turned into weeks. I began to forget what his voice sounded like. I'd catch myself listening to old voicemails just to hear him say, "Hi, Mom." Even those small recordings began to fade, his tone too casual, too distant. I replayed them until I could recite every word. Then I stopped listening because I realized I was memorizing something that no longer belonged to the present. The loneliness changed the rhythm of my life. Meals got smaller, mornings got quieter, nights stretched longer. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and reach for the phone, thinking something might have changed. It never had. I started leaving it on silent because hearing it not ring hurt more than any noise it could make. I realized that loneliness doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, first through missed calls, then through empty rooms, and finally through silence that becomes routine. I kept busy to fill the quiet. I joined a small book club in town, though I never read the books. I just liked hearing people talk. I volunteered at the local shelter once a week. The people there smiled when I arrived, and that was enough. It wasn't family, but it was human. It reminded me that I still existed to someone, even if it wasn't to the person I loved most. At night, before going to sleep, I'd sit by the window and talk to myself just to hear a voice in the room. I didn't pray for him to call anymore. I just hoped he was happy, that his life was full, that my absence didn't make a difference. But there were moments, small, painful ones, when I wished he would feel the same silence I did, just for a moment, just to understand. That month felt endless, a loop of waiting and pretending not to. The phone stayed silent, the food kept going cold, and somewhere between those small daily moments, I accepted that maybe this was what love becomes when it grows one-sided. Not anger, not hate, just a quiet ache that never fully leaves. I used to tell myself that parents shouldn't keep score, that love was supposed to be unconditional. But sitting in that empty house, I started remembering every sacrifice, every long day, every moment that built the life my son lived so easily. I could still see the nights I spent sewing uniforms when he was a boy, because we couldn't afford new ones. I could still smell the coffee I made before dawn to stay awake for my second job. I worked in a small grocery store by day and cleaned offices at night. Every dollar went into his future. I skipped meals, skipped rest, but never skipped his needs. I told myself it would all be worth it when he grew up and lived the life I never could. And he did. He got the education, the home, the family, all the things I had dreamed of for him. But somewhere along the way, I disappeared from that picture. When he started earning, I never asked for anything. Not money, not help, not even visits. I thought giving him freedom was also part of love. When he got married, I stayed out of their way, paid for part of the wedding, and told him not to worry about repaying me. Love shouldn't come with bills, I said. But now, looking back, maybe I made it too easy. Maybe I taught him that I would always give, even when there was nothing left to take. I had built his comfort out of my exhaustion, and he never noticed because comfort makes people forget what it costs. I thought about the house he lived in, the one I helped pay for with the last of my savings. I remembered the check I wrote without hesitation saying, "It's just money. You're my son." I remembered the wedding dress I helped his wife pick out, pretending I didn't notice how she looked past me in every store mirror. I remembered sending grocery money during the months he said work was slow. He never refused it, but he never said thank you either. Gratitude had quietly left our relationship long before that phone call. Now, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I realized I had built his whole world on the belief that love meant never expecting anything in return. And maybe that was my mistake. I never asked him to visit. I never asked him to call. I never reminded him that I was aging faster than time itself. I just gave, assuming he would one day understand. But love without limits doesn't teach appreciation. It teaches dependence. He didn't see me as a person anymore. I had become background, something that was always there, something that didn't need tending. Every photo in my house told a story he had forgotten. His baby pictures, his graduation, his first car, all framed neatly, dusted weekly, reminders of a life I built but no longer belonged to. I looked at those pictures one night and wondered if he still kept any of me. Maybe tucked away in some old album, maybe not. Maybe I existed to him now only as a phone number he didn't want to answer. It's strange how parents convince themselves that their children's success is enough reward. For years, I thought his happiness would fill the space of my loneliness. But happiness that doesn't include you eventually turns hollow. Watching his life from afar didn't give me pride anymore. It gave me distance. I used to defend him when others said he'd changed. I told everyone he was busy, successful, building his future. I never admitted that he had simply stopped looking back. That night, I sat at the dining table staring at the checkbook I hadn't opened in months. Every transaction told a story: tuition, rent, gifts, repairs, favors. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the pattern. It was always me giving, always him taking. I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being the foundation no one saw until it cracked. I closed the book, turned off the light, and told myself something I should have realized years ago. Love without boundaries doesn't make people closer. It teaches them how far they can go without you. The next morning, I made coffee and sat by the window. The silence was different that day. It wasn't just loneliness. It was clarity. I had spent my life giving without expecting, but now I wanted to learn what it felt like to keep something for myself. I didn't know where to start, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't wait for him to remember me anymore. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments that built quietly over the days that followed, like the first morning I didn't reach for my phone, the first night I didn't cook for two, the first weekend I didn't wait for his visit. I started to notice how often I had built my day around someone who never thought of me. My happiness had been tied to a person who didn't even know he was holding the rope. That truth wasn't cruel. It was just clear. Parents are taught that love means sacrifice, but no one ever explains what happens when that sacrifice becomes invisible. I had given and given until there was nothing left to take, and still it wasn't enough. That's when I finally understood. I was waiting for something that was never coming back. I began to move through the house differently. I stopped checking the mailbox as often. I stopped sitting by the phone. I told myself that maybe peace wasn't about being remembered. Maybe it was about no longer waiting to be. I tried saying it out loud once, just to hear how it sounded. He doesn't need me anymore. It hurt less than I expected. There was freedom in that sentence. Freedom from expectation, from disappointment, from the constant ache of wondering why love always felt like a one-way road. One morning I went outside and sat in my garden, something I hadn't done in years. The flowers had grown wild, the soil cracked from neglect, yet somehow they still bloomed. It struck me that I wasn't much different. I had been ignored, overlooked, left alone, yet I was still standing. Maybe that was enough. I didn't need his attention to prove my worth. I had survived too much to let absence define me. That moment didn't erase the pain, but it made it smaller. I looked around the yard, the same place where he once played as a child, and I told myself quietly, "You raised a man, but you didn't raise gratitude." Saying it didn't make me bitter, it made me honest. That evening I opened an old photo album. The pages smelled faintly of dust and time. I flipped through his childhood pictures, birthdays, school plays, family trips. Every photo showed a smile, every moment full of a future I had built for him. But none of them showed what came after, the part where the giver disappears once the gift is received. I realized I had spent years trying to be remembered through effort instead of simply being valued. That's the trap many parents fall into, believing that more love can fix distance. But distance doesn't shrink when you chase it. It grows. The truth became simple then. I couldn't change him. I couldn't make him call. I couldn't make him care. But I could stop giving him the power to hurt me by waiting. That was when I made a decision. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop confusing silence with patience. I called my lawyer the next day. I didn't tell anyone, not out of spite, but because I wanted to do something that wasn't for him, something for me. The appointment was short, practical, and quiet. We went over my documents, my house, my savings, everything that had my name on it. For years, I had left everything under the assumption that one day it would all go to him. I had written that will years ago, back when I still believed gratitude was permanent, but gratitude fades faster than paper lasts. The lawyer looked at me and asked gently, "Are you sure?" I nodded. I had never been more sure of anything. That was the moment I stopped being the background to someone else's life and started protecting what was left of my own. When I came home that day, I didn't feel angry. I felt light. I realized that love doesn't die when it's not returned. It just changes shape. It becomes something quieter, something you give to yourself when no one else remembers to. For the first time in years, I didn't look at the phone before going to bed. I didn't wonder what he was doing, who he was with, or why he didn't think of me. I just sat in the dark and felt the strange peace of being done waiting. The lawyer called me 2 days later to confirm everything was ready. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers neatly stacked in front of me. My name was printed across the top of every page: house deed, savings account, life insurance, investments. For decades, those papers had been my safety net and his future. Every decision I made, every penny I saved, was for him. I used to imagine he would one day thank me, that he would use what I built to give his children the same stability I fought for. But now, looking at those pages, all I could think was how easily I had handed over my peace of mind to someone who saw me as a burden instead of a blessing. That was the day I decided to take it all back, not to punish, but to protect what little of myself I had left. When I walked into the lawyer's office, it was quiet, almost sterile. He smiled politely and handed me a pen. The air felt heavy, but my hand was steady. The process was simple: change of beneficiary, transfer of assets, creation of a living trust. He explained everything in clear words, and I listened closely, wanting to understand every detail. Every signature I made that morning wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of understanding. I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was simply putting everything in the right place, in the hands of someone who had actually cared for me when no one else did. Over the past few years, my nurse, Clara, had been more present in my life than my own family. She showed up when I was sick, ran errands when I couldn't, and sat with me during the long, quiet evenings when no one else called. She never asked for anything. She never made me feel like a responsibility. She just helped because she wanted to. When my lawyer asked who I wanted to name as the new beneficiary, I didn't hesitate. I told him her name. He blinked, surprised, but didn't question me. He just nodded and began typing. I felt a strange calm wash over me as the words appeared on the screen. My estate, my savings, my will, all redirected to someone who had earned it through simple kindness. Signing those papers didn't feel like loss. It felt like closure. For the first time, my choices were about me, not about guilt or obligation. The pen glided across each page, and with every line I signed, I felt years of disappointment lift from my shoulders. I had spent my life giving away pieces of myself, hoping they would come back as love. Now I was giving to someone who had already shown love without asking for anything in return. It took 10 minutes to undo 30 years of assumption. When everything was done, my lawyer slid the documents into a folder and said, "It's official." He told me it was wise to set things up this way, to ensure I was taken care of while I was alive, not just after I was gone. That part struck me deeply. While I was alive. No one had thought about that in years, not even me. I had been preparing for everyone else's future without realizing mine was still unfolding. On the drive home, I felt no sadness, just a steady kind of peace. The world outside looked the same, busy streets, honking cars, people rushing. But I felt different. For once, I wasn't thinking about what he might say if he found out. I wasn't worried about his reaction or his disappointment. He had stopped caring long before this. I had finally accepted that my life didn't need to revolve around someone who had already let go. When I got home, I placed the folder in my drawer beside the other important papers. I didn't label it or hide it. It sat there plainly, like a quiet truth waiting to be discovered someday. I made a cup of tea, sat in my chair by the window, and let the weight of what I'd done settle in. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about reclaiming control after years of waiting for someone else to do the right thing. That night, for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up to check the phone. No guilt, no second guessing, just quiet satisfaction that everything I had built was finally in safe hands, hands that knocked on my door when everyone else stopped calling. The first few days after signing the papers felt almost unreal. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. There was no reason to. Some decisions are better left in silence. My days began the same. Tea in the morning, a walk through the garden, reading the newspaper I didn't really care about. But there was something different inside me. I no longer waited for the phone to ring. I no longer kept my ears open for footsteps or a familiar voice at the gate. It's strange how peace can feel foreign at first, like a house that's too quiet after years of noise. But it grows on you. It starts to feel natural. And soon, I realized I didn't miss the noise anymore. I had spent so long waiting to be remembered that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without expectation. Weeks passed, and I saw no sign of him, not a call, not a message, not even a forwarded holiday photo like he used to send when he remembered I existed. I didn't reach out either. The quiet wasn't painful anymore. It was proof that I was healing. My nurse, Clara, kept me company most days. She would come by with groceries or sit with me during lunch, chatting about small things, the weather, her children, her work. Her kindness filled the spaces my son had left behind, not because she replaced him, but because she reminded me that care doesn't always have to come from blood. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a picture of him and his wife. They were at a beach resort, smiling, glasses raised. The caption read, "New Beginnings." I stared at it for a long moment. There was no pain, just an understanding. He had found a life that didn't include me, and that was fine. But what struck me wasn't the picture. It was the realization that he hadn't noticed my absence. My birthday had passed 2 weeks earlier. For the first time in 30 years, there was no call, no card, no text, nothing. And I hadn't even been surprised. That's how detachment begins. Quietly, without anger, just an empty space where love used to live. I stopped checking my bank account around that time too. For years I had transferred money to help him. Just in case money, I used to call it. I didn't tell him that I had stopped. I simply let the habit end. Love built on convenience fades fast when the convenience disappears. I knew it would take time for him to notice. I wondered what would happen when he did. Would he call out of worry, out of guilt? Or would he wait, thinking I'd fix it eventually, like I always had? Parents make that mistake. We think silence teaches, but it only shocks them when it finally speaks. By the end of the month, I had found a new rhythm. I cooked less. I read more. I took short walks around the block every morning. The neighbors waved. Some asked about my son, and I gave them the same answer. He's busy. The lie didn't hurt anymore. It just saved me from explaining something they wouldn't understand. They'd nod politely, smile, and move on. People don't know what to say to a mother who's been forgotten. Every Sunday, I still set 2 plates at the table. Old habits die slow. But now I didn't waste food. I'd pack the extra meal for Clara to take home. She'd always thank me, even for the smallest things. Hearing that word, thank you, after so many years of silence, did something to me. It reminded me that kindness only grows when it's noticed. My son had stopped noticing long ago. By the 4th week, the loneliness had turned into something else. Strength. I realized that the pain I'd felt wasn't from losing him. It was from losing myself in him. Every call I'd made, every favor, every gesture, it had all been an attempt to stay relevant in a life that had already moved on. Now, I was done chasing relevance. I had found my peace in the quiet. That month of distance became the foundation for everything that came next. It taught me that sometimes love doesn't end with arguments. It ends with indifference. But when that indifference finally reaches you, it's not a tragedy. It's a release. And that release, as painful as it starts, becomes the beginning of freedom. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where everything feels still before the world wakes up. I was watering the small plants by my front porch when I heard it. A hard, frantic knock at the door. It wasn't the polite kind that waits for an answer. It was desperate, uneven, filled with panic. My heart jumped, thinking maybe something had happened to a neighbor. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the window beside the door. When I looked through the curtain, I froze. It was him, my son, the same boy who once told me, "Stop calling, we're busy." He was standing there, eyes red, hair messy, papers in one hand, a phone in the other. He looked nothing like the confident man I had raised, just tired, scared, and smaller somehow. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring through the curtain at a sight I never thought I'd see again. I could hear him breathing heavily, pacing a little, knocking again, harder this time. "Mom," he said, voice breaking, "please, open the door." I didn't. Not right away. I couldn't. There was a part of me that wanted to run and hug him, the same instinct that had driven every sacrifice I'd ever made. But another part, the one that remembered silence, rejection, and that cruel word busy, held me still. I stayed quiet, hidden behind the thin fabric, watching as his desperation grew. He knocked again, louder, calling my name. His tone shifted from pleading to guilt, then to panic. He kept saying, "I need to talk to you. Please, just let me in." The voice that once told me to stop calling was now begging for my attention. It's strange how life turns full circle, how the same words can change meaning depending on who's saying them and when. I didn't feel joy or victory. I just felt a deep sadness, not for him, but for how much distance it had taken for him to finally look back. After a while, he stopped knocking. I thought he might have left. But then I heard something else. The sound of him sitting down on the porch steps. Through the window, I could see him burying his face in his hands. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. I opened the curtain slightly, just enough to see the papers in his hand. They were wrinkled, creased, probably the trust documents. The realization hit me instantly. He had finally discovered what I had done. The money, the property, the estate, all of it no longer his. The panic wasn't just about losing wealth. It was about realizing the foundation he stood on had never truly belonged to him. For a few minutes I stood there, watching him silently. He kept talking through the door, saying things like, "I made a mistake," and "Please, I just need to explain." But explanations come too late when silence has already spoken. I didn't hate him. I didn't want revenge. I just didn't want to be hurt again. So I stayed quiet. The distance I had built wasn't punishment. It was protection. Eventually, I unlocked the door, not to let him in, but just to open it slightly. He looked up, startled. His eyes widened when he saw me. I didn't say a word. I simply stood there, holding the door half open, waiting. He started talking quickly, words tumbling out between breaths. He told me his wife had left him, that their house was in foreclosure, that everything had fallen apart after the trust transfer. He said he didn't know where else to go. His voice cracked when he said, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit between us because it said everything that needed to be said. I looked at him carefully, this man who once couldn't make time for me now standing outside my home as if time had stopped. I felt pity, but not weakness. I stepped back slightly and said in a calm, even voice, "You were busy. I didn't want to interrupt." Then I closed the door softly, not slammed, just closed. I stood behind it for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed. He didn't shout. He didn't knock again. He just stayed there for a while, then walked away. I watched him from the window, his shoulders slumped, his steps slow. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was closure, the kind that doesn't hurt, the kind that finally lets you breathe. That knock changed something in me. It didn't bring back what was lost, but it reminded me that silence, when earned, is powerful. I had spent years begging for his attention. Now, I realized I didn't need it anymore. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet but not heavy. It felt different, lighter somehow, like something long overdue had finally settled into place. I made my tea, opened the window, and watched the street outside. The sun was rising slowly, the light stretching over the pavement where my son had stood the day before. There was no car parked there now, no figure pacing, no voice begging, just emptiness. And for once it didn't hurt. It was a strange kind of peace, one I hadn't known in years. I thought that was the end of it, that maybe he'd move on. But 2 days later, a letter came. It wasn't written by him. It came from his bank. I didn't open it right away. I waited until evening, then sat at the table and read every word. His company had defaulted on multiple loans. Their accounts were frozen. Their assets, held under the old family trust, were now under legal review, and since my name was removed, he had no claim. Everything he thought was his had collapsed overnight. The following week I saw him again, not at my door this time, but across town at the lawyer's office. He looked smaller, older, as if the last month had aged him years. I was there for something unrelated, just signing a few final documents for my own affairs. But when our eyes met, he froze. He didn't speak, neither did I. There was no need. The silence between us said everything. I saw in his face what guilt looks like when it's finally real, not the kind that asks for forgiveness, but the kind that comes from understanding how deeply you've hurt someone who once gave you everything. Later that day, my lawyer told me what had happened in detail. His wife had left him soon after the trust transfer became public record. The mortgage payments had stopped. Their business partners had pulled out when they discovered his financial ties were cut off. It was all unraveling. "He might try to contact you again," the lawyer said, careful with his tone. I nodded. He already did. That night I sat in my chair with the lights off, thinking about everything. I wasn't proud of what had happened to him, but I wasn't guilty either. This wasn't revenge. It was reality catching up. He had built his comfort on an assumption that I would always be there, always waiting, always giving. But love without gratitude rots. Eventually, it collapses under its own weight. I had been the foundation. When I stepped away, everything built on top of me fell apart. That wasn't cruelty. That was cause and effect. A week later, he came back. Not demanding this time, not angry, just quiet. I heard his car pull up outside, and when I opened the door, he was standing there with nothing in his hands. No papers, no excuses, no pride. Just him. His eyes were tired, his voice soft. "I lost everything," he said. I didn't interrupt. He looked at me for a long time, waiting for some reaction, maybe comfort. But there was nothing left to give. He had taken that from me long ago. I handed him a cup of water, like I would to a stranger, and said, "You were busy. I didn't want to disturb you." My words landed heavy, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He nodded slowly, tears forming, but never falling. Then he sat on the porch step and drank the water silently. I didn't invite him in, not because I wanted to hurt him, because the house didn't feel like his anymore. It hadn't for a long time. For a moment watching him there, I remembered the boy he used to be, the one who brought me flowers from the yard, who called me after every exam, who said he'd take care of me one day. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had forgotten where he came from. And now, standing before me, I saw both, the boy who loved me and the man who broke me. It was heartbreaking, but it was honest. When he left that day, I didn't follow him to the gate. I didn't wave. I just stood by the window and watched him drive away slowly, his car disappearing at the end of the road. I knew he'd call again, and maybe one day I'd answer, but not yet. Some lessons can't be spoken. They have to be lived. What he felt now, the emptiness, the helplessness, the silence, was exactly what I had felt for years. The difference was, I had survived it, and maybe now he would learn how to. The days after that final visit passed quietly, almost too quietly. I no longer woke up expecting a knock at the door or a phone ringing off the hook. The chaos that had once followed my son's life no longer bled into mine. The air in the house felt clean, not because anything had changed inside it, but because I finally stopped carrying what wasn't mine anymore. The burden of waiting, worrying, forgiving, all of it had worn me down over the years, but now there was nothing left to drain me. For the first time in decades, peace didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like control. I saw him once more, about 2 weeks later. He came by unannounced, but this time he didn't knock right away. I saw him standing near the gate, just looking at the house. He had lost weight, and the confidence that once carried him was gone. He looked like someone searching for a version of himself he'd misplaced. I stepped outside, not to invite him in, but because I didn't want to hide. He turned when he heard my steps and gave a faint smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I could tell he was ashamed. We stood there for a long moment without saying anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, careful. He said he was trying to rebuild, that he'd found a small apartment, that he was working part-time. He didn't ask for money, not even once. For the first time in years, I heard humility in his tone, not pride. I nodded, told him I hoped he'd do well, and that was it. He thanked me before leaving. Just one word, but it meant more than any apology could. That evening, as I sat by the window with my tea, I realized something important. I no longer wanted revenge or recognition. I just wanted distance that didn't hurt. The trust I'd built for my nurse remained untouched. I never changed it back. It wasn't about punishing my son. It was about keeping my promise to myself, that I would never again give everything to someone who gave nothing back. My nurse, Clara, continued to help me every day. She made me laugh, reminded me to take my medicine, and treated me like a person, not an obligation. She never asked for anything in return, and that's exactly why I wanted her to have what I left behind. A month later, I got a letter from my son. The handwriting was uneven, like he'd written it in a hurry, or maybe after a long night. He said he finally understood why I'd done what I did. He wrote about how it felt to lose everything, how it taught him what real value meant, not money, not property, but people. He said he was sorry, not for what happened recently, but for every year he'd taken my presence for granted. I read the letter twice. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept my favorite old photos. Since then, he started calling once a week. Sometimes the conversations are short, a few minutes about how he's doing, how I'm feeling, or how his job is going. Other times we talk longer, mostly about small things. He doesn't ask for forgiveness anymore. He just shows up with consistency, something he never did before. And in that small effort, I've found something like closure. Not the kind that erases hurt, but the kind that lets you live with it peacefully. The neighbors noticed the change too. They'd ask, "Your son's been visiting again?" I'd just nod and say yes, leaving it at that. There's no need to explain that sometimes forgiveness isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It just sits quietly in the background, like a light you leave on at night, not because you're afraid of the dark, but because it helps you see your way back if you ever need to. I don't think things will ever be like they were before, but they don't have to be. What matters now is that I've learned the difference between love and dependence. Love listens. Dependence takes. For years I gave and waited. Now I give nothing but peace, to him and to myself. I answer the phone when I want to, not when I have to. And every time I hear his voice on the other end, calmer, steadier, I know he's learning too. The truth is, I didn't win anything. There's no pride in seeing your child broken. But there is peace in knowing you finally stopped breaking yourself to keep them whole. Even now, when I sit alone in the quiet of my home, I think about everything that happened, not with anger, but with the kind of acceptance that comes only after years of carrying pain too long. I never wanted to teach my son a lesson. I only wanted him to see me, to remember that behind every sacrifice was a person, not just a parent. For most of my life, I believed love meant giving without stopping. I thought silence was strength, patience was loyalty, and endurance was love. But the truth is, when you give endlessly to someone who only takes, you teach them that your kindness has no limits. And one day, they'll cross every line because they've learned you'll never draw one. That was my mistake. Not that I loved him, but that I never made him earn the comfort my love created. After everything, I don't hate him. Hate takes energy, and I've already spent enough of my life being tired. What I feel now is calm, the kind that doesn't need noise or closure. I've realized some things don't need to be fixed. They just need to be finished. When I think of that last night he came to my door, standing in the rain, begging to come in, I remember the years before it, all the nights I waited by the phone for a call that never came. I remember birthdays he forgot, holidays he skipped, messages he read but didn't answer, and I realized that when he finally came back, it wasn't out of love, it was out of need. But sometimes need is where humility begins. Now, our relationship is different. We speak, but not every day. We meet, but not out of obligation. He visits because he wants to, not because he needs something. And when he leaves, he hugs me a little longer than he used to. It's not the same kind of love we had when he was a child, but it's honest. It's slower, quieter, and real. That's all I ever wanted. Not perfection, not repayment, just honesty. He knows what he did, and I know what I allowed. We don't talk about it much because there's no need. The silence between us now isn't punishment, it's peace. Sometimes I see him sitting on the porch with his daughter, my granddaughter. He helps her with her schoolwork, the same way I used to help him. I watch them from the window, and I see a man trying to be better than the one he used to be. That gives me more comfort than any apology ever could. I don't remind him of the past. I don't bring up the years he disappeared. I just let him live in the present. Because I've learned that the past doesn't always need to be forgiven. Sometimes it just needs to stay behind you. At night, when I turn off the lights and lie in bed, I sometimes hear my phone buzz. Most of the time, it's him. A short message. "Good night, Mom." Simple words, but they carry more meaning now than anything grand he's ever said. It's strange how time reshapes people, how it forces them to see what they once ignored. The boy who once pushed me away now checks if I've eaten, if I'm feeling well, if I need anything. I rarely ask for help, but knowing he offers it, that's enough. That's what healing looks like. Not in dramatic apologies or tears, but in small, consistent actions that rebuild trust quietly. Looking back, I don't regret what I did. Not the silence, not the transfer, not even the door I didn't open that day. Those moments weren't about revenge. They were about survival. I had spent years trying to be the mother he needed. For once, I decided to be the woman I needed to be. Strong, steady, free. He lost a company, a house, and his pride, but he found something worth more. Awareness. And I found something I never thought I'd have again. Peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. He once told me to stop calling because they were busy. Now he calls just to say goodnight. That's not justice. It's balance. The world has a way of evening things out without shouting. Some people call it karma. I call it consequence. Either way, it came full circle. I didn't teach him through anger or revenge. I taught him by stepping back and letting life do what words never could. I still keep that phone on my bedside table. Sometimes I let it ring twice before answering, just to remind myself that I can, that the silence belongs to me now, not to him. And every time I pick up, hearing his voice softer, humbler, more human, I know he's still learning. Maybe we both are. Because forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about letting yourself stop hurting. And that's exactly what I've done. I stopped hurting. And finally, I'm free.